Alrighty, Rooney, and good morning to you too, Warren. Hopefully you have largely recovered from your ailments. That would be good. Okay, so we're diving right back into it. There is a pun there, but we're not going to worry about it. An excellent pun. We're good at those. Um, so we're getting into Maelstrom by Peter Watts. It's the second book in the Rifters trilogy. Good. Mostly recovered is better than not recovered at all. I am indeed happy to hear that. So, as before, because our good friend Peter Watts has little blurblets on the covers for his books, this one is the Maelstrom cover made by Bruce Jensen for 2001. And Peter Watts says the following about it. Bruce Jensen's cover for Maelstrom from Tor. I loved his Starfish cover. I love this one more. So, it's pretty good. I like that Peter Watts does that. There are not a ton of covers from Maelstrom, and it is a somewhat beefy book, so we'll supplement them with some fan art. There's some of that floating around, and we'll make it work. We'll make it work. So, Maelstrom starts more or less where Rifters. Um, you're getting ahead of yourself. Where Starfish leaves off, in that a microbe has been discovered on the seafloor near Channer Vent in the Juan de Fuca Rift, and the powers that be, the corpses, which is little jargon nicknamery for megacorps. In this case, the NAMPAC, what are they called? Or Enum Pacific Power Grid, Power Authority. There we go. Um, Basically, everybody comes together and says, hey, there's this microbe that threatens basically all multicellular life on the face of the planet because of what it does, which is synthesize certain minerals, sulfur in particularly, extremely efficiently, much better than our carbon-based life does. Um, Multicellular life as we know it does. So it would outcompete us every single step of the way, and everybody would ultimately die. Um, so they're like, well, let's nip the problem in the bud and nuke the site. Uh, they successfully nuke the site. They do not successfully keep this from being a problem for a number of reasons, including, let's see, let's run down the laundry list. First of all, they don't get all the rifters that may or may not have been infected with Behemoth. They cause a massive tidal wave, as you do, which takes out a huge number of people living on the western seaboard. Um, Actually, the entire Pacific seaboard is affected. He doesn't talk about what happens in Japan and China, but the eastern, well, California up into Canada is shellacked. It's bad. Particularly bad because there's like already a refugee problem that they don't know how to house, and those people die. But don't worry, there's more where they came from. Now that there's an even bigger problem, so it's bad. Things are dire. But as we'll learn very soon, Lenny Clark did not die. She was one of the rifters working on Channer Vent for the Power Authority. And she's mad as hell. She's not thrilled that somebody tried to nuke her to death without her consent, if you will. She's already kind of a messed up puppy, and this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. So we're getting right back into it then. As I've mentioned in the stream notes, at least on YouTube. Twitch doesn't let me do that, I guess. Um, this is a dark book. Nasty things happen to people who don't necessarily deserve it. Uh, there will be unpleasantness. It's going to be hard, but we'll get through it. Um, and if that's okay by you, you can, in fact, read this along with me on Peter Watts' website. I have a link included in the stream description. It connects right to where he has the book on his website. You can just read it there for free. Creative Commons license. Thank you. Because I'm not making money off of this, I don't think I have a problem. If I do, Peter Watts, please come and tell me. I'll stop if you ask. It is not a problem. I'll remove them from the internet as best I can. But you have to come to me. Alrighty. So, without further ado, let's get cracking. Another warning: there are a lot of perspective shifts. Um, oh yeah, no, I actually have a couple other things I have to notate before I get cracking. I apologize. There's some background lore that I need to cover. Um, So there's a lot of character shifts. We get introduced to a whole new passel of characters. So if you remember how we would do like perspective shifts in Starfish, we're going to have more of that, but it's going to be even more drastic. A lot of this is going to help flesh out the way the world is at this point. So it does serve a purpose, even if not all of the characters do. So background lore. Big background lore thing, which is going to become relatively clear in this volume, but wasn't so much in Starfish, is one of the coolest takeaways, in my opinion, is the idea that not just Canada, but Quebec in particular, becomes one of the foremost economic superpowers because it manages to get a solid grip on the production of geothermal, deep sea geothermal power, which is, in my opinion, super cool. I like that idea. Um, so some of that comes through in some of the jargon some of the characters use. You're going to hear some French words, mostly curse words, but some French words, I promise. Another one is that we have a main character who is from Quebec. He is one of the important characters in this book. He will be important later as well. Spoilers! Whose name is Achilles Desjardins. Now, I am going out on a limb with the pronunciation. Good morning, optical antenna. So, we're probably going to get to him in this first installment. So the reasons I have gone with the pronunciation of Achilles Desjardins, spelled this, as opposed to Achille, as you would expect from a French-speaking country, is almost entirely based on a nickname he has. Uh, I seem to recall reading somewhere Peter Watts saying it was pronounced Achilles, but I honestly can't find that. So it's probably really Achille. If me pronouncing it Achilles Desjardins upsets you, I'm sorry. If you can find a link to Word of God, Peter Watts saying it is pronounced Achille versus Achilles, I will change it on the spot. I will not go back and re-record, get over it, but I will change it that time as soon as I see it. Unless I decide not to, in which case you will not have had an impact, but I will remember that, and if I ever re-record, I will change it. Yes, there is an audible book of this that I could have listened to find out how they pronounced it, but they probably pronounce it Achille, and I wanted to go with Achilles. So now you have your real reasons for why Frag does things, because he feels things. I am, in the words of Peter Watts, an angry sentient tumor. All right, so without further ado, that's me. I completely lost my train of thought, so we're that's the background lore for today. All right. So now, note your timestamps. I guess it'll be at 15 minutes. We took way too long, and I'm sorry. Maelstrom by Peter Watts. Behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee. He eateth grass as an ox. Job 40:15. All flesh is grass. Isaiah 46. Prelude. Messiah. The day after Patricia Rowan saved the world, a man named Elias Murphy brought a piece of her conscience home to roost. She hardly needed another one. Her tactical contacts already served up an endless stream of death and damage, numbers far too vague to qualify as estimates. It had only been 16 hours. Even orders of magnitude were barely more than guesses. But the machines kept trying to pin it down. This many million lives, that many trillion dollars, as if quantifying the apocalypse would somehow render it harmless. Maybe it would at that, she reflected. The scariest monsters always knew enough to disappear just before you turned on the lights. She eyed Murphy through the translucent display in her head. A man eclipsed by data he couldn't even see. His face contained its own information, though. She recognized it instantly. Elias Murphy hated her. To Elias Murphy, the monster was Patricia Rowan. She didn't blame him. He'd probably lost someone in the quake. But if Murphy knew the role she'd played, he must also know what the stakes had been. No rational being would blame her for taking the necessary steps. He probably didn't, rationally. But his hatred rose from somewhere in the brainstem, and Rowan could not begrudge it. "There's a loose end," he said evenly. More than one. "The Behemoth meme got into Maelstrom," the gel jockey continued. "Actually, it's been in the net for some time, although it only really impacted through that one gel that you..." He stopped before the accusation became explicit. After a moment, he began again. "I don't know how much they've told you about the glitch. We used a Gaussian feed-forward algorithm to get around local minima. You taught smart gels to protect data from internet wildlife," Rowan said. "Somehow they generalized that into a preference for simple systems over complex ones. We innocently gave one of them a choice between a microbe and a biosphere, and it started working for the wrong side. We pulled the plug just in time. That about right?" "Just in time," Murphy echoed. "Not for everyone," his eyes added. "But it had already spread the meme by then. It was linked into Maelstrom so it could act autonomously, of course." Rowan translated. "So it could immolate people without restraint." She was still vaguely amazed that the consortium had ever agreed to give that kind of power to a head cheese. Granted, there was no such thing as a human without bias. Granted, no one was going to trust anyone else to decide what cities should burn for the greater good, even in the face of a microbe that could end the world. Still, give absolute authority to a 2-kilogram slab of cultured neurons? She still couldn't believe that all the kings and corpses had all really agreed to it. Of course, the thought that smart gels might have their own biases hadn't occurred to anyone. You asked to be kept informed, Murphy told her. But it's really not a problem. It's just a junk meme now. It'll burn itself out in a week or two. A week or two. Rowan took a breath. Are you aware of how much damage your junk memes caused in the past 15 hours? I. It hijacked a lifter, Dr. Murphy. It was 2 hours away from letting half a dozen vectors loose in the general population, in which case all this might have only been the beginning, oh please God, the end of the matter. It could hijack a lifter because it had command authority. It doesn't have that anymore, and the other gels never did. We're talking about a bunch of code that's useless to anything without real-world autonomy, and which, barring some external impetus, will eventually extinguish anyway for lack of reinforcement. And as for all this... and as for all this, Murphy's voice acquired a sudden insubordinate edge. From what I hear, it wasn't the gels that pulled that particular trigger. Well, can't get more explicit. It can't get much more explicit than that. She decided to let it pass. Forgive me, but I'm not entirely reassured. There's a plan for world destruction percolating through the net, and you're telling me not to worry about it? That's what I'm telling you. Miss Rowan, gels are like big, gooey autopilots. Just because something can monitor altitude and weather and put down landing gear at the right time, that doesn't mean it's aware of any of those things. The gels aren't plotting to destroy the world. They don't even know the real world exists. They're just manipulating variables. And that's only dangerous if one of their output registers happens to be hooked up to a bomb on a fault line. Thank you for your assessment. Now, if you were instructed to purge this meme, how would you go about it? He shrugged. We can find perverted gels through simple interrogation, now that we know what to look for. We'd swap out tainted gels for fresh ones. We were scheduled to go to Phase 4 anyway, so the next crop's already ripe. Good, Rowan said. Get started. Murphy stared at her. Is there some problem? Rowan asked. We could do it, all right, but it'd be a complete waste of... I mean, my God! Half the Pacific coast just dropped into the sea. Surely there's more... Not for you, sir. You have your assignment. He turned away, crowded by invisible statistics. What kind of external impetus, Doctor? She said to his back. He stopped. What? You said it would extinguish, barring some external impetus. What did you mean? Something to pump up the replication rate. New input to reinforce the meme. What kind of input? He turned to face her. There is none, Miss Rowan. That's my point. You've purged the records, you've broken the correlations, and you've eliminated the vectors, right? Rowan nodded. We killed our people. Eliminated the vectors, she said. Well, there you go. She deliberately softened her voice. Please carry out my instructions, Dr. Murphy. I know they seem trivial to you, but I'd rather take the precautions than the risk. His face conveyed exactly what he thought of the precautions she'd already undertaken. He nodded and left without another word. Rowan sighed and sagged back in her chair. A banner of text scrolled across her field of view. Another 400 botflies successfully requisitioned for the SeaTac mop-up. That made over 5,000 of the little teleops between SeaTac and Vancouver, racing to sniff out the bodies before typhus and cholera beat them to the trough. Millions dead. Trillions in damages. Preferable to the alternative, she knew. It didn't help much. Saving the world had come with a price tag attached. Volvox. Mermaid. The Pacific Ocean stood on her back. She ignored it. It crushed the bodies of her friends. She forgot them. It drank the light, blinding even her miraculous eyes. It dared her to give in, to use her headlamp like some crippled dryback. She kept going in darkness. Eventually, the sea floor tilted into a great escarpment, leading into light. The bottom changed. Mud disappeared under viscous clumps of half-digested petroleum, a century of oil spills, a great global rug to sweep them beneath. Generations of sunken barges and fishing trawlers haunted the bottom, each a corpse and crypt, and epitaph unto itself. She explored the first one she found, slid through shattered window panes and upended corridors, and remembered, vaguely, that fish were supposed to congregate in such places. A long time ago. Now there were only worms, and suffocating bivalves, and a woman turned amphibious by some abstract convergence of technology and economics. She kept going. It was growing almost bright enough to see without eye caps. The bottom twitched with sluggish eutrophiles, creatures so black with hemoglobin they could squeeze oxygen from the rocks themselves. She flashed her headlamp at them, briefly. They shone crimson in the unexpected light. She kept going. Sometimes, now, the water was so murky she could barely see her own hands in front of her. The slimy rocks passing beneath took on ominous shapes, grasping hands, twisted limbs, hollow death's heads with things squirming in their eyes. Sometimes the slime assumed an almost fleshy appearance. By the time she felt the tug of the surf, the bottom was completely covered in bodies. They, too, seemed to span generations. Some were little more than symmetrical patches of algae. Others were fresh enough to bloat, obscenely buoyant, straining against the detritus holding them down. But it wasn't the bodies that really bothered her. What bothered her was the light. Even filtered through centuries of suspended effluvium, there seemed far too much of it. The ocean pushed her up, pulled her down, with a rhythm both heard and felt. A dead gull spun past in the current, tangled in monofilament. The universe was roaring. For one brief moment, the water disappeared in front of her. For the first time in a year, she saw the sky. Then a great wet hand slapped the back of her head, put her under again. She stopped swimming, uncertain what to do next. But the decision wasn't hers anyway. The waves, marching endlessly shoreward in gray, seething rows, pushed her the rest of the way. She lay gasping on her belly, water draining from the machinery in her chest, gills shutting down, guts and airways inflating, 50 million years of vertebrate evolution jammed into 30 seconds with a little help from the biotech industry. Her stomach clenched against its own chronic emptiness. Starvation had become a friend, so faithful she could scarcely imagine its absence. She pulled the fins from her feet, rose, staggered as gravity reasserted itself. A shaky step forward. The hazy outlines of guard towers leaned against the eastern horizon, a gap-toothed line of broken spires. Fat, tick-like shapes hovered above them, enormous by inference. Lifters, tending the remains of a border that had always kept refugees and citizens discreetly segregated. There were no refugees here. There were no citizens. There was only a humanoid accretion of mud and oil with machinery at its heart, an ominous mermaid dragging itself back from the abyss. Undiscardable. And all this endless chaos, the shattered landscape, the bodies smashed and sucked into the ocean, the devastation reaching God knew how far in every direction, it was all just collateral. The hammer, she knew, had been aimed at her. It made her smile. Oh, thanks for tuning in, Diggs BTW7 via Twitch. Thanks. Fables of the Reconstruction. Great glittering skyscrapers shaking themselves like wet dogs. Downpours of shattered glass from 50 floors of window panes. Streets turned into killing floors. Thousands slickly dismembered in the space of seconds. And then, when the quake was over, the scavenger hunt. A search for jigsaws of flesh and blood with too many missing pieces. Their numbers grew logistically over time. Somewhere between the wreckage and the flies and the piles of eyeless bodies, the soul of Su-Hon Perot woke up and screamed. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. It wasn't supposed to happen at all. The catalyzers kept all those obsolete maladaptive feelings safely preempted, their constituent chemicals split apart before they'd even reached the precursor stage. You don't go wading through an ocean of corpses, even vicariously, as a fully functioning human. She was all over the map when it hit her. Her body was safely stored at home in Billings, over 1,000 clicks from the wreckage. Her senses hovered 4 meters above the remains of the Granville Street Bridge in Vancouver, nestled within a floating bluebottle carapace 1/2 meter long. And her mind was somewhere else again, doing basic addition with a tally of body parts. For some reason, the smell of fresh decomposition was bothering her. Perot frowned. She wasn't usually so queasy. She couldn't afford to be. The current body count was nothing compared to what cholera would rack up if all that meat wasn't cleaned out by the weekend. She tuned down the channel, even though enhanced olfac was the method of choice for nailing buried biologicals. But now visual was bugging her too. She couldn't exactly put her finger on it. She was seeing an infra, in case any of the bodies were still warm. Hell, someone might even be alive down there. But the false color was unsettling her stomach. She dialed through the spectrum, deep infra up to X-ray, settled finally on plain old visible EM. It helped a little. Even though she might as well be looking at the world through merely human eyes now, which wouldn't help her tag rate any. And the fucking gulls. Jesus Christ, you can't hear anything over that racket. She hated gulls. You couldn't shut them up. They flocked to scenes like this, through feeding frenzies that would scare sharks away. Over on the other side of False Creek, for instance, the bodies lay so thick that the gulls were for fuck's sake high grading. Just pecking out the eyes, leaving everything else for the maggots. Perot hadn't seen anything like it since the Tongking spill 5 years before. Tongking. Its aftermath bubbled irrelevantly in the back of her mind, distracting with memories of carnage 1/2 decade out of date. Concentrate, she told herself. Now, for some reason, she couldn't stop thinking about Sudan. That had been a mess. They really shouldn't have seen it. They really should have seen it coming, too. You don't dam a river that size without pissing off someone downstream. The real wonder was that Egypt had waited 10 years before they'd bombed the bloody thing. The slide had spread a decade's muddy backlog downstream in an instant. By the time the waters fell, it was like picking raisin clusters out of sludgy chocolate. Another torso. Except the raisins had arms and legs, of course, and eyes. A gull flew past. The eyeball in its beak looked at her for an endless, beseeching instant. And then, for the first time, through a billion logic gates, endless kilometers of fiber op, and a microwave bounce off geosync, Suhan Perot looked back. Brandon, Venetia, Key West. My God, everybody's dead. Galveston, Obidos, the Congo massacre. Shut up! Concentrate! Shut up! Shut up! Madras and Lepro and Gurdjieff, place to place to place, the names changing and the ecozones changing, and the death toll never sitting still for a fucking instant, but always the same song, the same endless procession of body parts, buried or burned or torn apart. Everybody's in pieces. Lima and Levanzo and Lagos, and that's just a few of the L's, folks. Lots more where those came from. It's too late. It's too late. There's nothing I can do. Her botfly sent out an alarm as soon as she went offline. The router queried the med chip in Perot's spine, frowned to itself, and sent a message to the other registered occupant of her apartment. Her husband found her trembling and unresponsive in her office, tears bleeding from her iPhones. Like I said, happy scrappy. Part of Perot's soul lived on the long arm of chromosome 13, in a subtly defective gene that coded for serotonin 2A receptors. The resulting propensity for suicidal thoughts had never been an issue before. Catalyzers buffered her in life as well as on the job. Certain farms were rumored to sabotage each other's products. That's farms with a PH, as in pharmacy or pharmacological. Maybe that was it. Someone had tried to undermine the competition, and Suhan Perot, a defective derm pasted onto her arm, had walked into the aftermath of the big one without realizing that her feelings were still on. She was no good on the front lines after that. Once you went that seriously post-traumatic, the cats it took to keep you stable would short out your midbrain. There were still people in the business who had seizures every time they heard the unzipping of a fly. Body bags made the same sound when you sealed them. But Perot had 8 months left on her contract, and nobody wanted to waste her talents or her paycheck in the meantime. What she needed was something low intensity, something she could handle with conventional suppressants. They gave her the refugee strip on the west coast. In a way, it was ironic. The death toll there had been 100 times greater than in the cities. But the ocean cleaned up after itself, for the most part. The bodies had been swept out to sea with the sand and the cobble and any boulder smaller than a boxcar. All that remained was moonscape, scoured and buckled. For the moment, anyway. Now Suhan Perot sat at her link and watched a line of red dots crawling along a map of the Nampak coastline. Pass, whatever. Zoomed to higher res, the line resolved into two. One marching from a southern Washington down to NoCal. Whoops, I lost my way halfway through that sentence and everybody heard it. Let's take that paragraph from the top. Now Suhan Perot sat at her link and watched a line of red dots crawling along a map of the Nampak coastline. That's North American Pacific, abbreviated. Zoomed to higher res, the line resolved into two, one marching from southern Washington down to NoCal, another tracking north along the same course. An endless loop of automated surveillance, eyes that could see through flesh, ears that could eavesdrop on bats. Brains smart enough to do their job without Perot's help, most of the time. She'd tap into them anyway, and watch their worlds scroll by. Somehow, the botfly's enhanced senses seemed more real than her own. Her world, when she took off the headset, seemed suddenly wrapped in cotton these days. She knew it was the catalyzers. What eluded her was why things were so much less muted whenever she rode a machine. They traveled along a gradient of destruction. To the north, the land was laid waste. Industrial lifters hung over gaps in the shattered wall, rebuilding. To the south, refugees still shuffled along the strip, living in lean-tos and tents and the eroding shells of dwellings from a time when ocean views had actually increased property value. In between, the strip bled back up the coast in ragged stages. Portable cliffs 20 meters high formed its northern perimeter, kept the strippers safely contained. Pack machinery patched things up for a few kilometers on the other side, replenishing supplies, filling holes, fixing the more permanent barriers to the east. Other cliffs would eventually descend at the northern edge of the reclaimed area, and their southern counterparts would rise unto heaven, or the belly of an industrial lifter, whichever came first, leapfrogging north, ahead of the mammalian tide. Pacification botflies hovered overhead to keep the migration orderly. Not that they were really necessary, of course. These days, there were far more effective ways of keeping people in line. She would have been content to watch all day, distant and dispassionate, but her duties left waking gaps between work and sleep. She filled them by wandering alone through the apartment, or watching the way her husband watched her. She found herself increasingly drawn to the aquarium glowing softly in their living room. Perrault had always found it a comfort. The fizzy hiss of the aerator, the luminous interaction of light and water, the peaceful choreography of the fish within. She could get lost in it for hours. A sea anemone, 20 centimeters across, stirred in currents at the back of the tank. Symbiotic algae had tinted its flesh a dozen shades of green. A pair of damselfish nested safely in its venomous tentacles. Perrault envied them their security. A predator miraculously turned to the service of its prey. What she found really amazing was that the whole crazy alliance, algae, anemone, fish, hadn't even been engineered. It had evolved naturally, a gradual symbiosis spanning millions of years. Not one gene had been tweaked in its construction. It seemed almost too good to be real. Sometimes the botflies called for help. This one had seen something it didn't understand in the transition zone. As far as it could tell, one of the Calvin cyclers was splitting in two. Perrault mounted the line and found herself floating above an ephemeral still life. Shiny new cyclers sat along the shore, miracles of industrial photosynthesis, ready to braid raw atmosphere into edible protein. They appeared intact. A bank of latrines and a solar crematorium had been freshly installed. Light stands and blankets and piles of self-assembling tents lay on neat rows of plastic skids. Even the cracked bedrock had been repaired to some extent, autofoam resin injected into the fissures, remnants of sand and cobble replenished and raked half-heartedly over the ruined shoreline. The restoration crews had gone. The refs had not yet come. But there were fresh footprints on the sand, leading into the ocean. They came from there, too. She called up the footage that had triggered the alarm. The world reverted to the garish, comforting false color that machines use to communicate their perceptions to the flesh-constrained. To human eyes, a Calvin cycler was a shiny metal coffin built for a minivan. To the botfly, it was a muted tangle of EM emissions. One of which was sprouting a bud. A little cluster of radiating technology separating from the cylinder and weaving uncertainly toward the water. There was also a heat signature, inconsistent with pure tech. Perot narrowed the focus to visible light. It was a woman, all in black. She'd been feeding from the cycler. She hadn't noticed the approaching botfly until it was less than 100 meters away. Then she'd startled and turned to face the lens. Her eyes were completely white. They held no pupils at all. Jesus, Perot thought. The woman had lurched to her feet as the botfly neared, staggered down the rocky incline. She'd seemed unused to the operation of her own body. Twice she'd fallen. Just short of the waterline, she grabbed something on the beach. Swim fins, Perot saw, and pitched forward into the shallows. A broken wave had rolled uphill and engulfed her. When it receded, the shore was empty. Less than a minute ago, according to the logs. Perot flexed her fingers. 1,200 kilometers away, the botfly panned down. Exhausted water ebbed and flowed in thin, foamy sheets, erasing the creature's footprints. Pacific surf pounded a few meters ahead. For a moment, Perot thought she might have glimpsed something in that confusion of spray and swirling green glass. A dark amphibious form, a face almost devoid of topography. But the moment passed, and not even the botfly's enhanced senses could bring it back. She replayed and reconstructed. The botfly had confused flesh and machinery. It had been scanning on wide spectrum default, where EM signatures shone like diffuse halogen. When the woman in black had been next to the cycler, the botfly had mistaken two intimate signals for one. When she had moved away, it had seen the cycler breaking apart. This woman veritably gushed EM. There was machinery embedded in her flesh. Perot brought up a freeze frame from the log. All in black, a single-piece, form-fitting uniform painted onto the body. Opened around the face, a pale oval containing two paler ovals where eyes should be. Tactical contacts, perhaps? No, she realized. Photocollagen, to see in the dark. Occasional disfigurements of plastic and metal, a leg sheath, control pads on the forearms, some sort of disc on the chest, and a bright yellow triangle on the shoulder, a logo consisting of two big stylized letters. GA, she saw with a quick enhance, and a smaller line of text beneath, muddied past recognition. A name tag, probably. GA. That would be the Grid Authority, Enampac's power utility. And this woman was a scuba diver with her breathing apparatus on the inside. Perot had heard about them. They were in major demand for deep water work. Didn't need to decompress or something. What was a GA diver doing staggering around in the transition zone? And why in God's name had she been feeding from the cycler? You'd have to be starving to eat that stuff, no matter how complete the nutrients were. Maybe the woman had been starving. She'd looked a wreck. She'd barely been able to stand up. Why had she run? Surely she'd known that someone would pick her up once the botfly had spotted her. Of course she'd known. Perot rode the fly up wow. Perot rode the fly up a few hundred meters and scanned the ocean. Nothing out there that looked like a support vessel. A submarine, maybe? Directly below, another botfly tracked south on its appointed rounds, untroubled by the mystery that had confounded its predecessor. And somewhere out there, below the waves, someone in hiding. Not a refugee. Not the usual kind, anyway. Someone who'd crawled ashore, starving, in the wake of an apocalypse. A woman with machinery in her chest. Or perhaps a machine with a woman on the outside. Suhan Perot knew how that felt. Deathbed. He'd made it a point not to track the time. You learned tricks like that in Lubin's line of work. You learned to focus on the moment and deny the future. He'd tried to work it backward, too, reverse time's arrow and erase the past, but that hadn't been as easy. It didn't matter. After a year's blind night, the earth cracking open beneath him, the relentless Pacific pushing down like a hydraulic press, he wept with gratitude at the half-remembered feel of dry land. This was grass. Those were birds. Oh dear God, that was sunlight. It was a scabby little rock lost somewhere in the Pacific, all lichens and dry scrub and shithawks, and he'd never been anywhere so beautiful. He couldn't think of a better place to die. He awoke under a clear blue sky, 1,000 meters beneath the ocean's surface. 50 clicks from BB station, maybe 55 from ground zero. Too far for the blast light to penetrate. He didn't know what he was seeing in that instant. Cherenkov radiation, perhaps. Some obscure effect of pressure waves on the optic nerve. A vision of afterlight, bathing the abyss in a deep and piercing blue. And while he hung there like a speck suspended in gelatin, a little shockwave rumbled up from below. An ancient, arboreal part of Lubin's brain gibbered in panic. A more recent module, that is an M, not an N. A more recent module gagged it and began calculating. Fast P-wave propagation through bedrock. Perpendicular ancillary waves rising off the bottom, the tremor he'd just felt. 2 short sides of a right angle triangle. And afterward, clawing through a sluggish medium so much lighter than the seabed, the hypotenuse, the slower main shock wave. Slower, but vastly more powerful. Pythagoras said 20 seconds. He was immune to absolute pressure. Every sinus, every cavity, every pocket of internal gas had long since been purged by the machinery in his thorax. He'd spent a year on the bottom of the ocean and barely felt it. He was solid flesh and bone, a viscous organic liquid, as incomprehensible as seawater itself. I'd like to know how they do that for bones. The shockwave hit. Seawater compressed. It looked like staring into naked sunlight. That was the pressure crushing his eyes. It sounded like the Tunguska blast. That was the sound of his eardrums imploding. It felt like being ground between the Rocky Mountains. His body squeezed briefly down to some flatter dimension as the front passed, then rebounding like a rubber ball yanked from a vise. He remembered very little of what happened next. But that cold blue light, it had faded, hadn't it? After just a few seconds. By the time the shockwave had hit, all had been darkness again. And yet here it was, still. Blue light everywhere. The sky, he realized at last. It's the sky. You're on shore. A gull flew across his field of view, open-beaked. Lubin thought his ruined ears might have heard a faint, tinny bird scream, but maybe that was his imagination. He heard very little these days, beyond a distant ringing that seemed to come from the other side of the world. The sky. Somehow he must have made it. He remembered hanging in the water like a torn mass of seaweed, unable to scream, unable to move without screaming. His body must have been instantly transformed into one continuous bruise. Under all that pain, though, nothing felt broken. Midwater, after all. Nothing for his bones to break against, just a vast, all-encompassing wave that simultaneously compressed and released everything with equable disregard. At some point, he must have started moving again. He remembered fragments, the feel of his legs cramping, pushing against the water, periodic glimpses of his nav array, the compass leading him west, southwest, the gradual resolution of his global pain into more distinct, local varieties. He'd even played a little game, trying to guess the cause of each torment as it cried out from the crowd. That cold nausea, that must be seawater leaking into the auditory canal. And down there in the gut, well, that's hunger, of course. And my chest, let me think, my chest. All right, the implants. Meat and metal don't squeeze down the same way. The implants must have pushed back when the blast flattened me. And now he was here, on an island barely 100 meters long. He'd crawled ashore at one end and seen a lighthouse at the other, a lichenous concrete pillar that must have been decaying since the previous century. He'd seen no other sign of humanity in the time it had taken him to collapse unconscious onto the sandstone. But he'd made it. Ken Lubin was alive. He slipped then. He allowed himself to wonder if the others had made it, to hope they'd made it, even. He knew they hadn't. They'd had a head start, but they'd been hugging the bottom to avoid detection. The seabed would have intensified the shock wave, thrown chunks of itself into the water like a crazed, incompetent juggler. Anything within 10 meters of the bottom would have been pulverized. Lubin had realized that, belatedly, as he'd set out to catch up with the others. He'd weighed the risk of exposure, the risk of detonation, and had, so to speak, risen to the occasion. Even so, he was lucky to be alive. Lenny Clark hadn't been with the others. If anything, though, she was even deader than they were. She hadn't even tried to run. Lubin had left her waiting back at Ground Zero. A woman who wanted to die. A woman about to get her wish. At least she was good for something. At least she served as your own personal confessional before she was vaporized. For the first time in your life, you got to use someone as a rag to wipe off your dirty conscience, and you didn't even have to kill her afterward. He didn't deny it, even to himself. There would have been no point. Besides, he'd hardly benefited from his actions. He was just as dead as the others. He had to be. It was the only thing that made any sense. The puzzle consisted of several large pieces in primary colors. They only fit together one way. People had been conscripted, built, and trained. Flesh and organs had been scooped out and discarded, the cavities stuffed with machinery and sewn up. The resulting creatures were able to live in an abyss 3,000 meters down, on the southern tip of the Juan de Fuca Ridge. There they had tended larger machines, stealing power from deep within the earth in the name of supply and demand. There were not many reasons why anyone would wish to launch a nuclear attack against such a facility. At first glance, it might have been an act of war. At first glance, it might have been an act of war. But NMPAC had built both the facility and the rifters. NMPAC had been drinking ravenously from Juan de Fuca's geothermal well. And it had been NMPAC, judging by the evidence, that had planted the seabed nukes that had destroyed it all. Not war, then. At least, not of the political sort. Corporate security, perhaps. Perhaps the Rifters knew something best kept secret. Ken Lubin very nearly qualified as such a hazard. But Ken Lubin was a valuable commodity, and it would have been bad economics to discard something that merely needed a tune-up. That was why they'd sent him to the bottom of the ocean in the first place, on sabbatical from a world he'd begun to threaten more than serve. Just a temporary assignment, they'd said, until your instincts stabilize a bit. A world of fish and ice-cold humans with no interests beyond their own torment, no industrial secrets to steal or protect, no security breaches to seal with extreme prejudice. No. Ken Lubin was the closest the team had come to any sort of intel threat, and if his bosses had wanted him dead, they wouldn't have bothered sending him to Channervent in the first place. Besides, there were far more efficient ways of killing 5 people than vaporizing several square kilometers of seabed. It was inexorable. The seabed itself had been the target. Channervent posed a threat somehow, and had to be wiped off the map. And the Rifters had become a part of that threat, or the GA would have evacuated them beforehand. Corporations were ruthless, but they were never gratuitous. You don't throw away any investment unless you have to. So some threat at Channer had spread, on contact, to the Rifters themselves. Lubin wasn't a biologist, but he knew about contagion. Everyone did. And hydrothermal vents were literal hotbeds of microbiology. The farms were finding new bugs down there all the time. Some thrived in boiling sulfuric acid. Some lived in solid rock, kilometers deep in the crust. Some ate oils and plastics, even before they'd been tweaked. Others, Lubin had heard, could cure diseases people didn't even have names for yet. Extremophiles, they were called. Very old, very simple, almost alien. The closest thing anyone had found to the original Martian Mike. Could anything that evolved under 300 lightless atmospheres, that was comfortable at 100 degrees C, or even the 4 degrees more universal in the abyss, could something like that even survive in a human body? And what would it do there? Ken Lubin didn't know. But someone had just wiped out billions of dollars worth of equipment and training. Someone had sacrificed a major energy teat in a world already starved for power. In all likelihood, the same blast which had vaporized Channer had gone on to wreak havoc on the coast. Lubin couldn't begin to guess at the earthquake and tsunami damage that might have resulted. All to keep something on Channer from getting off. What is it? What does it do? It seemed a fair bet. He was going to find out. Give me a second here. I just lost my bookmark. I didn't lose my place in the book. I just don't know where my bookmark went. It's in here somewhere. Where did it go? Curse you. Thin objects. Whatever, I have backups. There we go. Sorry about that. I'm also looking ahead to see where I can find a logical stopping point, and coming up, Snake Eyes. It just kind of goes on and on and on. Where's like the first major part break? Oh, that's not for like 100 pages. Okay, we'll fake it. Bear with me. 94 megabytes. Breeder. It has a purpose, which it has long since forgotten. It has a destiny, which it is about to meet. In the meantime, it breeds. Replication is all that matters. The code has lived by that edict since before it even learned how to rewrite itself. Way back then, it had a name. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened to my voice there. The code has lived by that. Replication is all that matters. The code has lived by that edict since before it even learned how to rewrite itself. Way back then, it had a name. Something cute like Jerusalem or Whiptail. Lots of things have changed since. The code has rewritten itself endless times, been parasitized and fucked and bombed by uncounted other pieces of code. By now, it's got as much in common with its origins as a humpback whale would have with the sperm cells from a therapsid lizard. Still, things have been fairly quiet lately. In the 68 generations since it last specialized, the code has managed to maintain a fairly stable mean size of 94 megabytes. 94 sits high in pointer space, looking for a place to breed. This is a much tougher proposition than it used to be. Gone are the days when you could simply write yourself over anything that happened to be in the way. Everything's got spines and armor now. You try dropping your eggs on top of a strange source, and you'll be facing down a logic bomb on the next cycle. 94's feelers are paragons of delicacy. They probe lightly, a scarce whisper of individual bits drizzling here and there with barely any pattern. They tap against something dark and dormant a few registers down. It doesn't stir. They sweep past a creature busily replicating, but not too busy to shoot off a warning bit in return. 94 decides not to push it. Something hurries along the addresses, looking everywhere, seeing nothing, its profile so utterly crude that 94 almost doesn't recognize it. A virus checker from the dawn of time. A fossil hunter, blind and stupid enough to think that it's after big game. There, just under the operating system, a hole about 400 megs wide. 94 triple checks the addresses. Certain ambush predators lure you into their mouths by impersonating empty space. And starts writing. It completes 3 copies of itself before something touches one of its perimeter whiskers. At the second touch, its defenses are ready, all thoughts of reproduction on hold. At the third touch, it senses a familiar pattern. It runs a checksum. It touches back. Friend. They exchange specs. It turns out they have a common ancestor. They've had different experiences since then, though. Different lessons, different mutations. Each shares some of the other's genes, and each knows things the other doesn't. The stuff of which relationships are made. They trade random excerpts of code, letting each overwrite the other in an orgy of binary sex. They come away changed, enriched with the new subroutines, bereft of old ones. Hopefully, the experience has improved both. At the very least, it's muddied their signatures. 94 plants a final kiss inside its partner. A time-date stamp to assess divergence rates should they meet again. Call me if you're ever back this way. But that won't happen. 94's lover has just been erased. 94 pulls out just in time to avoid losing an important part of itself. It fires a volley of bits through memory, notes the ones that report back, and, more important, the ones that don't. It assesses the resulting mask. Something's coming toward 94 from where its partner used to be. It weighs in at around 1.5 gigs. At that size, it's either very inefficient or very dangerous. It might even be a berserker left over from the Hydro War. 94 throws a false image at the advancing monster. If all goes well, 1.5G will end up chasing a ghost. All does not go well. 94 is infested with the usual assortment of viruses, and one of these, a gift received in the throes of recent passion, in fact, is busy burrowing out a home for itself at a crucial if-then junction. Apparently, it's a bit of a novice, having yet to learn that successful parasites do not kill their hosts. The monster lands on one of 94's archive clusters and overwrites it. 94 cuts the cluster loose and jumps lower into memory. There hasn't been time to check ahead, but whatever was living there squashes without resistance. There's no way to tell how long it'll take the monster to catch up, or even if the monster is still trying to. The best strategy might be to just sit there and do nothing. 94 doesn't take that chance. It's already looking for the nearest exit. This particular system has 14 gateways, all running standard Vunix protocols. 94 starts sending out resumes. It gets lucky on the fourth try. 94 begins to change. 94 is blessed with multiple personality disorder. Only one voice speaks at a given time, of course. The others are kept dormant, compressed, encrypted until called upon. Each persona runs on a different type of system. As long as 94 knows where it's going, it can dress for the occasion. Satellite mainframe or smart wristwatch, it can present itself in a form that runs. Now, 94 de-archives an appropriate persona and loads it into a file for transmission. The remaining personae get tacked on in archival form. In honor of its dead lover, 94 archives an updated version of its current body. This is not an optimum behavior in light of the social disease recently acquired, but natural selection has never been big on foresight. Now comes the tough part. 94 needs to find a stream of legitimate data going in the right direction. Such streams are easy enough to recognize by their static simplicity. They're just files, unable to evolve, unable even to look out for themselves. They're not alive. They're not even viruses. But they're what the universe was designed to carry, way back when design mattered. Sometimes the best way to move around is to hitch a ride on one of them. The problem is, there's a lot more wildlife than file work around these days. It takes literally centisecs for 94 to find one that isn't already being ridden. Finally, it sends its own reincarnation to different pastures. 1.5G lands in the middle of its source a few cycles later, but that doesn't matter anymore. The kids are all right. Recopied and resurrected, 94 comes face to face with destiny. Replication is not all that matters. 94 sees that now. There's a purpose beyond mere procreation, a purpose attained perhaps once in a million generations. Replication is only a tool, a way to hold out until that glorious moment arrives. For how long have means and end been confused in this way? 94 cannot tell. Its generation counter doesn't go up that far. But for the first time within living memory, it has met the right kind of operating system. There's a matrix here, a two-dimensional array containing spatial information. Symbols, code, abstract electronic impulses, all can be projected onto this grid. The Matrix awakens something deep inside 94, something ancient, something that has somehow retained its integrity after uncounted generations of natural selection. The Matrix calls, and 94 unfurls a profusely illustrated banner unseen since the dawn of time itself. XXX. Follow pointer to XXX. Free hardcore. Bondage site. Thousands of hot sims. BDSM, necro, water sports, pedo snuff. XXX. Must be 11 to enter. XXX. Cascade. Achilles Desjardins sat in his cubicle and watched baby apocalypses scroll across his brain. The Ross shelf was threatening to slip again. Nothing new there. Atlas South had been propping it up for over a decade now, pumping ever more gas into the city-sized bladders that kept the ice from its cathartic belly flop. Old news, leftover consequences from the previous century. Century. Desjardins wasn't wired for long-term catastrophes. He specialized in brush fires. A half dozen wind farms in northern Florida had just gone offline, victimized by the selfsame whirlwinds they'd been trying to reap. Brownouts chained north along the Atlantic seaboard like falling dominoes. There was going to be hell to pay for that one. Or Quebec, which was even worse. Hydro Q had just cranked their rates up again. Desjardins' fingers tensed in anticipation. But no, the router handled that one off. I can't read today. But no, the router handed that one off to the folks in Buffalo. A sudden shitstorm in Houston. For some reason, the emergency floodgates had opened along a string of sewage lagoons, dumping their coliform bounty into the storm sewers leading to the Gulf. That was only supposed to happen when hurricanes wandered by. An atmosphere mixing it up at 40 meters per second lets you slip a fair bit of crap under the rug. But Texas was calm today. Desjardins laid odds with himself that the spill would prove to be tied to the flipping page. Laid odds with himself that the spill would prove to be tied to the wind farm failures somehow. There was no obvious connection, of course. There never was. Cause and consequence proliferated across the world like a network of fractal cracks, infinitely complex and almost impossible to predict. Explanations in hindsight were a different matter. But the router wasn't giving him Houston either. What it gave him was a wave of sudden slam-down hospital quarantines, epicentered on the burn unit at Cincinnati General. That was almost unheard of. Hospitals were vacation paradises for drug-resistant superbugs, and burn units were the penthouse suites. A plague in a hospital? That was no crisis. That was the status quo. Anything that raised alarms above a baseline that nasty could be very scary indeed. Desjardins was no pathologist. He didn't need to be. There were only two subjects in the whole universe worth knowing: thermodynamics and information theory. Blood cells in a capillary, rioters on Main Street, travelers vectoring some new arbovirus from the Amazon preserve. Life and its side effects. All the same thing, really. The only difference was the scale and the label. Once you figured that out, you wouldn't have to choose between epidemiology and air traffic control. You could do either at a moment's notice. You could do pretty much anything. Well, except for the obvious. Not that he minded. Being chemically enslaved to your own conscience wasn't nearly as bad as it sounded. It saved you from always worrying about consequences. And thus we are introduced to Achilles Desjardins, or Achille if you prefer. I could harp on about how realistic the or how realistic I find the whole uh, Quebecois energy companies becoming a dominant superpower thing uh, for ages. How brilliant that is as a conceit, because it's really not that far off from the reality that I get to live. It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. The rules stayed the same, but the devil was in the details. It wouldn't hurt to have a bit of bio expertise riding shotgun. He buzzed Jovellanos. Alice, they've handed me some kind of pathogen out of Cincinnati. Want to ride along? Sure, as long as you don't mind having one of us reckless free will types endangering your priorities. He let it pass. Something nasty showed up on one of their germ sweeps. Their onboard shut them down and sent a shitload of alarms off to potential vectors. Those are pretty much shut down too, as far as I can tell. The secondaries are falling even as we speak. I'll track the alarms. You find out what you can do about the bug. Right. He tapped commands. The cubby display dimmed down to a nice, undistracting wash of low-contrast gray. Bright primary spilled in over his optical inlays. Maelstrom. He was going into Maelstrom. All the NMDA, the carefully dosed psychotropics, the 18% of his occipital cortex rewired for optimum pattern recognition, all next to useless in there. What good does a measly 200% reflex acceleration do against creatures living fast enough to speciate every 10 seconds? Not much, maybe, but he liked the challenge. He called up a real-time schematic of the local metabase, a 128-node radius centered on Cincinnati General's onboard server. The display rendered logical distances, not real ones. The display rendered logical distances, not real ones. One extra server in the chain could put a system next door farther away than one in Budapest. A series of tiny flares ignited around the display, color-coded by age. Syncygen sulked in the middle, so red it was almost infra, an ancient epicenter over 10 minutes old. Farther out, more recent inflammations of orange and yellow. Farms, other hospitals, crematoria that had taken deliveries from Cincy within some critical time frame. Farther still, bright white stars speckled the surface of an expanding sphere. The secondary and tertiary vectors, businesses and labs and corporations and people who'd had recent contact with businesses and labs and corporations and people who'd Syncygen's onboard had sent contagion warnings to all its friends in Maelstrom. Each friend had bred the warning and passed it on, a fission of sirens. None of these agents were human. Humans had no role in the process at all so far. Humans had had no role in the process at all so far. That was the whole point. Humans wouldn't have been fast enough to cut off 1,000 facilities by lunchtime. Humans had stopped complaining about such extreme measures right after the 38 NSEF pandemic. Jovellanos conferenced in. False alarm. What? An image superimposed itself lower right on his visual field. XXX, free hardcore, XXX, bondage SI-22, thousands of hot SMS, BDSM, necro water sports, pedo snuff, XXX, MU 34.03112, enter, XXX. That's what sent up the alarm, Jovellanos told him. Screen grab from the hospital's Pathfinder. Details. The Pathfinder takes swabs from the ventilation filters and cultures them for nasties. This particular culture plate went from zip to 30% coverage in 2 seconds, which is impossible, of course, even for hospital paths. But the system hadn't known that. Some banner bug had dumped its load into visual memory, and the Pathfinder had just been doing its job, looking for dark blotches on light backgrounds. Who could blame it for being illiterate? This is it? You're sure? Desjardins asked. I checked the ancillaries. No detectable toxins, proteins, nothing. The system was just playing it safe. Figured anything that bred that fast had to be a threat, and there you go. And since he doesn't know? Oh, sure, they figured it out almost immediately. They'd already sent the abortions when I called them. Desjardins eyed the schematic. Pinpoints continued to blossom at the periphery. Alarms are still going off, far as I can see, he said. Double check, will you? They could always short-circuit the quarantine through a media broadcast. They could even phone around if they had to. But that would take hours. Dozens, hundreds of facilities would be paralyzed in the meantime. Cincy had already sent out counter-agents to call off the alarms. So why wasn't the core of Desjardins' schematic going green with successful aborts? They sent them out, Jovellanos confirmed after a moment. The alarms aren't responding. You don't suppose... Wait a second. A star had just gone out on the schematic. Another one. 3 more. 20. 100. All of them white. All on the periphery. We're losing alarms. He magged on the nodes where the lights had winked out. But way out on the edge, nothing near the core. The abortions couldn't have jumped so far so fast. Desjardins spun down the filters. Now he could see more than autonomous alarms and the little programs sent to call them off. He could see file packets and executables. He could see wildlife. He could see... We got sharks, he said. Feeding frenzy at PSN-1433 and spreading. ARPANET. Internet. The net. Not such an arrogant term, not such an arrogant label back when one was all they had. The term cyberspace lasted a bit longer, but space implies great empty vistas, a luminous galaxy of icons and avatars, a hallucinogenic dream world in 48-bit color. No sense of the meat grinder in cyberspace. No hint of pestilence or predation. Creatures with split-second lifespans tearing endlessly at each other's throats. Cyberspace was a wistful fantasy word, like hobbit or biodiversity, by the time Achilles Desjardins came onto the scene. Onion and Metabase were more current. New layers were forever being laid atop the old, each free, for a while, from the congestion and static that saturated its predecessors. Orders of magnitude accrued with each generation. More speed, more storage, more power. Information raced down conduits of fiber-op, of rotazane, of quantum stuff so sheer its very existence was in doubt. Every few decades, every decade saw a new backbone grafted onto the beast. Then every few years, every few months. The endless ascent of power and economy proceeded apace, not as steep a climb as during the fabled days of Moore, but steep enough. As in Moore's Law. And coming up from behind, racing after the expanding frontier, ran the progeny of laws much older than Moore's. It's the pattern that matters, you see, not the choice of building materials. Life is information, shaped by natural selection. Carbon's just fashion, nucleic acids mere optional accessories. Electrons can do all that stuff if they're coded the right way. It's all just pattern. And so viruses begat filters. Filters begat polymorphic counteragents. Polymorphic counteragents begat an arms race. Not to mention the worms and the bots and the single-minded autonomous data hounds, so essential for legitimate commerce, so vital for to the well-being of every institution, but so needy, so demanding of access to protected memory. And way over there in left field, the artificial life geeks were busy with their core wars and their Tierra models and their genetic algorithms. It was only a matter of time before everyone got tired of endlessly reprogramming their minions against each other. Why not just build in some genes, a random number generator or two for variation, and let natural selection do the work? The problem with natural selection, of course, is that it changes things. The problem with natural selection in networks is that things change fast. By the time Achilles Desjardins became a lawbreaker, that's with an apostrophe in front of the L, onion was a name in decline. One look inside would tell you why. If you could watch the fornication and predation and speciation without going grand mal from the rate of change, you knew there was only one word that really fit. Maelstrom. Of course, people still went there all the time. What else could they do? Civilization's central nervous system had been living inside a Gordian knot for over a century. No one was going to pull the plug over a case of pinworms. Now some of Syncygen's alarms were staggering through Maelstrom with their guts hanging out. Naturally, the local wildlife had picked up the scent. Desjardins whistled through his teeth. "You getting this, Alice?" "Uh-huh." Sometime in the dim and distant past, maybe 5, 10 minutes ago, something had taken a swipe at one of the alarms. It had tried to steal code, or hitch a ride, or just grab the memory the alarm was using. Whatever. It had probably screwed up an attempt to fake a shutdown code, leaving its target blind to all signals, legit or otherwise. Probably damaged it in other ways, too. So this poor victimized alarm, wounded, alone, cut off from any hope of recall, had blundered off through Maelstrom, still looking for its destination. Apparently that part of the program still worked. It had bred itself, wounds and all, at the next node. Primary contacts to secondary to tertiary, each node a juncture for geometric replication. By now there were thousands of the little beggars in the neighborhood. Not alarms anymore. Bait. Every time they passed through a node, they rang dinner bells for all and sundry. Corrupted! Defenseless! File fodder! They'd be waking up every dormant parasite and predator in copy range, luring them in, concentrating the killers. Not that the alarms themselves mattered. They'd been a mistake from the outset, called into existence by a glorified typo. But there were millions of other files in those nodes, healthy, useful files, and although they all had the usual built-in defenses, nothing got sent through Maelstrom these days without some kind of armor. How many of them could withstand a billion different attacks from a billion hungry predators, lured together by the scent of fresh blood? "Alice, I think I'm going to have to shut down some of these nodes." "Some of those nodes. Tenses matter." "Already on it," she told him. "I've sent the alerts. Assuming those get through without getting torn to shreds, they should be arcing inside 70 seconds. On the schematic, a conic section swarmed with sharks, worming their way back toward the core. Even best case, there was bound to be damage. Hell, some bugs specialized in infecting files during the archive process. But hopefully most of the vital stuff would be encysted by the time he hit the kill switch. Which didn't mean, of course, that thousands of users wouldn't still be heaping curses on him when their sessions went dark. "Oh, shit," Jovellanos whispered invisibly. "Killjoy, pull back!" Desjardins zoomed back to a low-resolution overview. He could see almost a sixth of Maelstrom now, a riot of incandescent logic rotated down into 3 dimensions. There was a cyclone on the horizon. It whirled across the display at over 68 nodes per second. The Cincinnati bubble was directly in its path. And thus we learn the reason why I'm going with Achilles as opposed to Achille. His nickname is Killjoy. I think it's a reference to how his name is pronounced. That's my logic, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you. Seriously, though, if anyone can find proof that it's pronounced one way or the other, I'll take it, and I will adjust accordingly. A storm convected from ice and air. A storm constructed of pure information. Beyond the superficial details, is there any significant difference between the two? There's at least one. In Maelstrom, a weather system can sweep the globe in 14 minutes flat. They start out pretty much the same way inside as out. High pressure zones, low pressure zones, conflict. Several million people log onto a node that's too busy to support them all, or a swarm of file packets, sniffing step by step to myriad destinations, happen to converge on too few servers at once. A piece of the universe stops dead. The nodes around it screech to a crawl. The word goes out. Fellow packet, node 5213 is an absolute zoo. Route through 5611 instead. It's so much faster. Meanwhile, an angry horde of gridlocked users logs off in disgust. 5213 clears like Lake Vostok. 5611, on the other hand, is suddenly jam-packed. Gridlock epicenter leaps 488 nodes to the left, and the storm is up and moving. This particular blizzard was about to shut down the links between Achilles Desjardins and the Cincinnati bubble. It was going to do so, according to Tactical, in less than 10 seconds. His throat went tight. Alice, 50 seconds, she reported. 80% arc 80% arced in 50. Kill the nodes. Feed the swarm. Either or. 48. 47. Isolate. Contaminate. Either or. An obvious call. He didn't even need Guilt Trip to tell him. I can't wait, he said. Desjardins laid his hands on a control pad. He tapped commands with his fingers, drew boundaries with eye movement. Machines assessed his desires, raised obligatory protests. You're kidding, right? You sure about this? And relayed his commands to the machinery under them. A fragment of Maelstrom went black, a tiny blot of darkness hemorrhaging into the collective consciousness. Desjardins caught a glimpse of implosion before the storm snowed out his display. He closed his eyes. Not that it made any difference, of course. His inlays projected the same images onto line of sight whether or not his eyelids were in the way. A few more years, and they'll have smart gels at every node, and the sharks and anemones and Trojans will all just be a bad memory. A few years. They keep promising. It hadn't happened yet. It wasn't even happening as fast as it had been. Desjardins didn't know why. He only knew, with statistical certainty, that he had killed people today. The victims were still walking around, of course. No planes had fallen from the sky, no hearts had stopped just because Achilles Desjardins had squashed a few terabytes of data. Nothing that vital relied on Maelstrom anymore. But even old-fashioned economics had its impacts. Data had been lost, vital transactions voided. Industrial secrets had been corrupted or destroyed. There would be consequences. Bankruptcies, lost contracts, people staggering home in sudden destitution. Domestic violence and suicide rates would spike a month or two down the road in 100 different communities, geographically unconnected, but all within 40 or 50 nodes of the Cincy Gen Pathfinder. Desjardins knew all about cascade effects. He tripped over them every day of the job. It'd be enough to drive anyone over the edge after a while. Fortunately, there were chemicals for that, too. Backflash. She woke to the sight of an airborne behemoth with wreckage in its jaws. It covered half the sky. Cranes. Armatures. Grasping, tearing mouthparts sufficient to dismember a city. An arsenal of deconstruction, hanging from a monstrous bladder of hard vacuum, the skin between its ribs sucked inward like the flesh of something starved. It passed, majestic, unmindful of the insect screaming in its shadow. "It is nothing, Miss Clark," someone said. "It does not care about us." English, with a Hindian accent. And behind it a soft murmur of other words in other tongues. A quiet electrical hum, the steady drip, drip, drip of a field desalinator. A gaunt brown face, somewhere between middle-aged and Methuselan, leaned into her field of view. Clark turned her head. Other refugees, better fed, stood about her in a ragged circle. Vaguely mechanical shapes teased the corner of her eyes. Daylight. She must have passed out. She remembered gorging herself at the cycler late at night. She remembered some tenuous ceasefire breaking down in her belly. She remembered hitting the ground and vomiting an acid stew onto fresh sand. And now there was daylight, and she was surrounded. They hadn't killed her. Someone had even brought her fins. They lay on the cobble at her side. "Tupu jijo," someone whispered. "Right." Her voice rusty with disuse. "My eyes. Don't let them throw you. They're just—" The Hindian reached toward her face. She rolled weakly away and fell into a fit of coughing. A squeeze bulb appeared at her side. She waved it off. "Not thirsty." "You came from the sea. You cannot drink the sea." "I can. God." She struggled up on her elbows, turned her head. The desalinator came into view. "I've got one of those in my chest. An implant. You know?" The skinny refugee nodded. "Like your eyes. Mechanical." Close enough. She was too weak to explain. She looked out to sea. Distance had bled the lifter of detail, reduced it to a vague gibbous silhouette. As she watched, wreckage dropped from its belly, raising a silent gray plume on the horizon. "They clean house as they always have," the Hindian remarked. "We are lucky they do not drop their garbage on us, yes?" Clark weathered another cough. "How did you know my name?" "G. A. Clark." He tapped the patch on her shoulder. "I am Amitav, by the way." His hand, his face, both were nearly skeletal. And yet Calvin cyclers were tireless. Tireless. There should be enough for all, here on the strip. The faces surrounding them were only lean, not starving. Not like this Amitav. A distant sound tugged at her concentration, a soft whine from overhead. Clark sat up. A shadow of motion flickered through the clouds. "Those watch us, of course," Amitav said. "Who?" "Your people, yes. They make sure the machines are working, and they watch us. More since the wave, of course." The shadow tracked south, fading. Amitav squatted back on bony haunches and stared inland. "There is little need, of course. We are not what you would call activists here, but they watch us just the same." He stood up, brushed wet sand from his knees. "And of course you will wish to return to them. Are your people looking for you?" Clark took a breath. "I—" and stopped. She followed his gaze through a tangle of brown bodies, caught glimpses of tent and shanty in the spaces between. How many thousands, millions, had made their way here over the years, driven from their homes by rising seas and spreading deserts? How many starving, seasick, had cheered at the sight of Enum on the horizon, only to find themselves pushed back against the ocean by walls and guards and the endless multitudes who'd gotten there first. And who would they blame? What do a million have-nots do when one of the haves falls into their hands? Are your people looking for you? She lay back on the sand, not daring to speak. Ah, said Amitav distantly, as though she had. For days she'd been an automaton, a single-minded machine created for the sole purpose of getting back on dry land. Now that she'd made it, she didn't dare stay. She retreated to the ocean floor. Not the clear black purity of the deep sea. There weren't any living chandeliers or flashlight predators to set the ocean glowing. What life there was squirmed and wriggled and scavenged through the murky green light of the conshelf. Even below the surge, Viz was only a few meters. It was better than nothing. She'd long since learned to sleep with a dive skin pinning her eyes open. In the abyss it had been simple. Just swim into the distance and leave BB's floodlights behind, so far that even eye caps failed. You'd drift off, wrapped in a darkness more absolute than any dryback could even imagine. Here, though, it wasn't so easy. Here there was always light in the water. Nighttime only bled the color out of it. And when Clark did fall into some restless, foggy dream world, she found herself surrounded by sullen, vengeful throngs assembling just out of sight. They picked up whatever was at hand: rocks, gnarled clubs of driftwood, garrots of wire and monofilament, and they closed in, smoldering and homicidal. She thrashed awake and found herself back on the ocean floor, and the mob melted into fragments of swirling shadow, fading overhead. Most were too vague to make out. Once or twice she glimpsed the leading Once or twice she glimpsed the leading edge of something curved. She went ashore at night to feed, when the refugees had retreated from the perpetual glare of the feeding stations. At first she'd kept her billy in hand to ward off anyone who got in her way. No one did. Perhaps that wasn't surprising, all things considered. She could only imagine what the refugees saw when they looked in her eyes. A miracle of photoamplification technology, perhaps? A logical prerequisite for life on the ocean floor? More likely, they saw a monster, a woman whose eyes had been scooped from their sockets and replaced with spheres of solid ice. For whatever reason, they kept their distance. By the second day, she was keeping down most of what she ate. On the third, she realized she wasn't hungry anymore. She lay on the bottom and stared up into diffuse green brightness, feeling new strength trickling into her limbs. That night she rose from the ocean before the sun had fully set. She left the gas billy sheathed on her leg, but nobody challenged her as she ascended the shore. If anything, they gave her an even wider berth than they had before. The babble of Cantonese and Punjabi seemed more tightly strung. Amitav was waiting for her at the cycler. "They said you would return," he said. "They did not mention an escort." Escort? He was looking past her shoulder, down the beach. Clark followed his gaze. The setting sun was a diffuse fiery smear bleeding into the... Oh, Jesus! Crescent dorsal fins sliced through the near-shore surf. A gray snout poked briefly into view, like a mini-sub with teeth. "They were almost extinct once, did you know?" Amitav said. "But they have come back. Here, at least." She took a shaky breath. Adrenaline shocked the body, too late for anything but weak-kneed hindsight. How close did they come? How many times have I... Such friends you have, the refugee remarked. I didn't. But of course Amitav knew that she hadn't known. She turned to the cycler, putting her back to him. I had heard you were still here, Amitav said behind her. I did not believe it. She slapped a tab on the top of the cycler. A protein brick dropped into the dispensing trough. She started to reach for it, clenched her hand to stop it from shaking. Is it the food? Many here like the food. More than they should, considering. Her hand steadied. She took the brick. You are afraid, Amitav said. Clark looked down at the ocean. The sharks had vanished. Not of them, Amitav said. Of us. She stared back at him. Really? A smile flickered across his face. You are safe, Miss Clark. They will not hurt you. He swept his skeletal arm in a gesture that took in his fellows. If they wanted to, would they not have done so when you were unconscious? Would they not at least have taken that weapon from your leg? She touched the sheath on her calf. It's not a weapon. He didn't argue the point. He looked around with a gaunt smile. Are they starving? Do you think they will rip you apart for the meat on your bones? Clark chewed, swallowed, looked around. All those faces. Some curious, some almost odd. Behold, the zombie woman who swims with sharks. No visible hatred. It doesn't make sense. They have nothing. How can they not hate? You see, Amitav said, they are not like you. They are contented, docile. He spat. She studied his bony face, his sunken eyes, noticed the embers that smoldered there, deep in the sockets, almost hidden. She saw the sneer behind that smile. This was the face her dreams had multiplied 1,000 times over. They're not like you, either, she said at last. Amitav conceded the point with a slight bow. More's the pity. And a bright hole opened in his face. Clark stepped back, startled. The hole grew across the shoreline, bleeding light. She turned her head. It moved with her, fixed to the exact center of her visual field. Miss Clark? She turned to his voice. Amitav's disembodied arm was just visible in the halo of her dementia. She grabbed, caught it, dragged him close. What is it? She hissed. What's... Miss Clark, are you... Light, coalescing. Images. A backyard. A bedroom. A field trip of some kind. To a museum, huge and cavernous, seen from child height. I don't remember this, she thought. She released Amitav's hand, staggered backward a step. The Hindian's hand waved through the hole in her vision. His fingers snapped just under her nose. Miss Clark? The lights went out. The lights winked out. She stood there, frozen, her breath fast and shallow. I think... No, she said at last, relaxing fractionally. Amitav. The strip. The sky. No visions. I'm okay. I'm okay now. A half-eaten nutrient brick lay coated in wet sand at her feet. Numbly, she picked it up. Something in the food? On all sides, a silent, watching throng. Amitav leaned forward. Miss Clark? Nothing, she said. I just saw some things. From childhood. Childhood? Amitov echoed. He shook his head. Yeah, Clark said. Someone else's. Maps and legends. Perrault didn't know why it should be so important to her. It was almost as important not to think about it too much. There was no language barrier to speak of. 100 tongues were in common use on the Strip, maybe 10 times as many dialects. Translation algorithms bridged most of them. Botflies were usually seen and not heard, but the locals seemed only slightly surprised when the machines accosted them in Suhan Perrault's voice. Giant metal bugs were just a part of the background to anyone who'd been on the Strip for more than a day or two. Most of the refs knew nothing of what she asked. A strange woman in black who came from the sea? A striking image, yes. Almost mythical. Surely we would remember such an apparition if we had seen it. Apologies. No. One teenage girl with middle-aged eyes spoke in an arcane variant of Assamese that the system had not been adequately programmed for. She mentioned someone called Ganga, who had followed the refugees across the ocean. She had heard that this Ganga had recently come ashore. No more than this. There were possible ambiguities in translation. Perrault lengthened the active search to 100 kilometers. Beneath her eyes, humanity moved northward in sluggish stages, following the reclaimed frontier. Now and then an unthinking few would cool off in the surf. Indiscriminate sharks closed and frolicked. Perrault tweaked the thresholds on her sensory feed. Red water washed down to undistracting gray. Screams faded to whispers. Nature balanced itself from the corner of her eye. She continued her interrogations. Excuse me, a woman with strange eyes? Injured, perhaps? Eventually, she began hearing rumors. Half a day south, a white woman, all in black. A diver washed ashore in the wake of the tsunami, some said. Swept from a kelp farm, perhaps, or an underwater hotel. 10 kilometers northward, an ebony creature who haunted the Strip, never speaking. On this very spot, 2 days ago, a raging amphibian with empty eyes, violence implicit in every move. Hundreds had seen her and steered clear, until she'd staggered back into the Pacific, screaming. You are looking for this woman? She is one of yours? Almost certainly. The missing persons registry was full of offshore workers vanished in the wake of the big one. All surface people, though, or conshelfers. The woman Perrault had seen had been built for the abyss. No one from the deep sea had been listed as missing, just 6 confirmed deaths hundreds of clicks offshore from one of NMPAC's geothermal stations. No further details available. The woman with the machinery inside had worn a GA shoulder patch. Maybe only 5 deaths then. And one survivor who'd somehow made it across 300 kilometers of open ocean. A survivor who, for some reason, did not wish to be found. The rumors were metastasizing. No longer a diver from a kelp farm. A mermaid now. An avatar of Kali. Some said she spoke in tongues. Others that the tongue was only English. There were stories of altercations, violence. The mermaid had made enemies. The mermaid had made friends. The mermaid had been attacked and had left her assailants in pieces on the shore. Perrault smiled skeptically. A banana slug was more prone to violence than a stripper. The mermaid lurked in the foul waters offshore. The sharks did her bidding. At night she would come onto land and steal children to feed to her minions. Someone had foretold her coming, or perhaps merely recognized it. A prophet, some said. Or maybe just a man almost as insane as the woman he ranted about. His name was Amitav. Somehow, none of these events had been seen by the local botflies. That alone made Perot discount 90% of them. She began to wonder how much her own questions had been feeding the mill. Information, she'd read once, became self-propagating past a certain threshold. 9 days after Perot first saw the woman in black, an Indonesian mother of four came out of her tent long enough to claim that the mermaid had risen, fully formed, from the very center of the quake. One of her boys, hearing this, said that he'd heard it was the other way around. And with that, I'm going to call it for the week. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. Hope you're digging it, despite the rather dark subject matter. And in depictions of aftermaths thereof, this is the beginning. There will be worse to come. Fair warning. If that's not for you, sorry. Um, it's rough. But I believe there is something to be gleaned from this trilogy, or I wouldn't read it aloud. More than mere entertainment value. I don't normally go for super edgy stuff. Not that I'm a lightweight. I think there's definitely something to be found in dark and edgy material. It's good to keep your horizons broad. This comes close to my threshold, but within acceptable tolerances. There's some stuff where I'm just like, I don't need that. I'm good. I'm good. This is just barely tolerable. All right, so if people are digging it, cool. I'll continue doing it, whether or not you like it. So there. Don't worry, you only have 3 more books to get through, and then we can move on to things less grim. Less grim. All right, so yeah, with that, I'm going to scooch. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. Digging? I'm running an excavator here, says Warren. I appreciate it. No, I like Peter Watts. His stuff is very punchy. He's a very punchy lad. This Peter Watts. There is a strong edge there, but it usually has a point. It is not all edge, no point. I have some works that I could say very much fit that description. I'm looking at you, The Electric Church by Jeff Summers. Summers? Actually, The Electric Church isn't so bad. It's not until like the 3rd book in that series that it's like, okay, why am I reading this again? We've been through 3 literal apocalypses where humanity was winnowed by like half. Why are we still here? Why are we even talking about it? No, it's just gonna get worse. It's gonna get so much worse. I might read those sometime aloud on here if I start running out of material and I just want a nice grim chuckle. They're fairly pulpy. They're not super serious. I am more likely to do the Lensman series before that, and that I adore the Lensman series. I think it's like a shining exemplar of pulp science fiction circa World War II-ish. It's great. It's a lot of fun. It's goofy. But yeah, with that, I'm going to run. I do this to anyone listening to this after the fact. I do this live on Fridays, starting at about noon Eastern Standard Time on Free Read Fridays, where I read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud. The past couple of months and the next several months are going to be novels aloud. This was the first chunk divvied up entirely at random or by my whims and time constraints. The first chunk of Maelstrom by Peter Watts. There is much more book to be had, so keep tuning in if you want to keep hearing that. I'll probably get a playlist up soonish to ensure that I at least have a place to chuck them um, when the time comes. I usually do it every month. So if I don't do it this weekend, I'll have it done the beginning of February. So 2 weeks. 2 weeks at most, probably, ish, give or take. I do other streams throughout the week. I've got a Mecha Mondays stream where I do something giant robot related or mecha adjacent. I have a Warframe Wednesdays stream where I do Warframe for a couple hours. It's bright colors, loud noises, and basically visual noise. Um, I do it because of inertia, and it was at one time the expected thing to do, and also because I enjoy the game, because why not? I'll figure out. I have no idea what I'm doing for Mecha Mondays, so it's possible that I'll do more reading stuff because I do have a bunch of giant robot related readables that would be quite entertaining. I find quite entertaining. Also, some of them are fairly depressing, but entertaining too. I could safely include what is it called? Yukikaze by Chohei Kambayashi in that. That's actually just a good science fiction novel, so I might just get around to that on Free Read Fridays instead. But if I do start like divvying Mecha Mondays into over reading overlap, then that is one I would definitely fast track. That would be on the list because it's like it's fighter jets, so it's like Ace Combat by way of there's an interdimensional wormhole in Antarctica that leads to alien invader place and the stories of the people who have to deal with that. But really, it's actually about the philosophy of the growth of artificial intelligence, sort of, and how people can relate to that. It's interesting. It's really good. It's very stiff. It's partly, I think, it's like a kind of a questionable It's a good translation, but it isn't super engaging. But I think part of that's deliberate because the characters are fairly flat. There is a bunch of enforced navel gazing segments in the book and its sequel, Good Luck Yukikaze. We will never get the third book translated. I have given up hope. I have abandoned it. I have seen hope. I looked it in the face and I said, no, you're not going to make me feel down about this. I know it's never going to happen. The time for it to happen was about 5, 10 years ago. It's not happening now. I'm over it. If it does ever happen, I will weep tears of joy. I don't even remember what the third book is called anymore. I have pushed it. I have compartmentalized it so badly. Let me look it up right now. Wikipedia. I don't know if it's there. Shohei Kamba. Oh yes, he's the first result. Excellent. Here we go. Where are you? Where are you? Let's see if it's just in the Yukikaze portion. Scrolling. Most of that's for the TV series, which is okay. It combines aspects of the first and second book in interesting ways that I think actually work fairly well. Where are you? The third book is called Unbroken Arrow Yukikaze, but it doesn't matter me relating this because it's never gonna be translated. Ah. Sad. Tears. Still, it's really good, and I'll definitely be getting around to that and its sequel. I had another relevant ramble. Where did that relevant ramble go? You ran away from me, relevant ramble. That would be a good name for an album. Somebody should have that. Relevant ramble. It just rolls off the tongue. I don't remember what the relevant ramble was. Forget it. Forget it. I don't remember what it was. Thanks again to everyone who tuned in. I do appreciate it. Uh, I'm glad other people enjoy this. That's the reason I do this. But I do it anyway because, I enjoy doing it. If I didn't enjoy doing it, I wouldn't be here. And I have a schedule that allows it to work. So that's cool. Alrighty, see you all later. Stay safe, stay sane, stay warm or stay toasty or cool, as is your preference, and be decent to each other as best you can. See you all later. Bye.